Thanks for waiting a few extra minutes. We wanted to make sure folks were able to find this place. This is my first time here. It's stunning, so thanks to all of you for coming out. My name is Luis Alvarez. I am the director of the Institute of Arts and Humanities, and it is my pleasure to offer a warm welcome to yet another fantastic event in our Challenging Conversations series. We're thrilled with so many of you here and have a terrific program in store. Before introducing our fabulous speaker and guest of honor, I'd like to share a brief word about IAH, the Institute of Arts and Humanities, and perhaps another brief word about the genesis of tonight's event. In just its first year, IAH is a hub for all things arts and humanities. At UC San Diego, we strive to cultivate and encourage interdisciplinary research and teaching and public dialogue. We want to equip our students, our faculty, and the general public with the kind of creativity, empathy, and analysis for imagining and putting into practice a collaborative and more equitable human experience. We also want to highlight the promise of arts and humanities, how arts and humanities can stand tall in the face of a seeming onslaught of inhumanity. Inspired by what we might call the politics of the possible, IAH wants to bring all of us together, students, faculty, and the wider public, to collaboratively make sense of the past, navigate the present, and we hope imagine a different and better future. Challenging Conversations, the lecture series which tonight's event is a part of, is an integral part of this ambitious vision. When we first imagined this series, Challenging Conversations, back in the late summer and early fall, we simply wanted to bring difficult topics and questions to the table for smart folks to discuss in generative, even disorienting ways. The challenge in Challenging Conversation was intended to be about how and with whom we think and speak as much as what we think and speak. And this continues to be the case, of course, but the idea of a challenging conversation has taken on new meaning in recent months. It seems as if we're all mired in one big, long, extended, challenging conversation that we wake up to every day and go to sleep with every night. Tectonic political shifts have at once inspired folks to stand up, speak back to power, and do the right things for the right reasons, and recall the longer histories of such struggle. Following their lead, IAH has hosted challenging conversations on a number of different occasions this year, including events on race and state violence, another on from Japanese internment to the Muslim ban, yet another on the end of history, lessons of totalitarianism for the 21st century, tonight's event, and yet a final event on June 1st with Princeton professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor on Black Lives Matters in the Trump era. And I should add a quick footnote on how our last few events of the year have come together. We initially hoped to have tonight's guest, Professor Kelly Lytle Hernández and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor here together for a more broad dialogue, back and forth challenging conversation about race and policing. Schedules didn't pan out. We ended up with two events a couple of weeks apart, but this is all to say that tonight's conversation doesn't end here. It will be picked up and continued on June 1st, and we hope that all of you will come out for that event as well. There are flyers to my left that you can pick up on your way out. I should also make one other announcement for another IAH event, which is on campus next Thursday, May 25th. It is a film screening and discussion of the award-winning documentary, a film I have seen and really like. My friend and colleague, Natalia Molina, a professor in the history department, will also be part of this. The film is East LA Interchange, featuring the filmmaker Betsy Callan. That's Thursday, May 25th at the Atkinson Auditorium at 12:30 to 3. Flyers are also to my left. So now on to the reason why we're all here tonight. Kelly Lytle Hernández is one of the nation's leading historians of race, policing, immigration, and incarceration in the United States. She is Associate Professor of History at UCLA, and I might add, a UCSD alumna, pre-doc, and postdoc. Her award-winning book, Migra, A History of the U.S. Border Patrol, published by University of California Press in 2010, explored the making and meaning of the U.S. Border Patrol in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. It argued that the century-long surge of U.S. immigration law enforcement in the borderlands is, in fact, a story about race in America. Migra, and just a few years after its publication, is already a seminal and must-read book in Chicano border immigration and U.S. history, has been showered with distinction, including the prestigious Weber Clements Prize for the best nonfiction book on Southwestern America. Her list of accolades is far too long to list here, but suffice to say, her books, articles, and teaching have distinguished her as among the most formidable voices in the scholarship, public debates, and movements for social justice when it comes to race policing, immigration, and incarceration. And I should point out that this is evident especially in just the last few months, when it's been hard for me to just surf the internet without coming across any number of her really remarkable, accessible, and brilliant essays with titles like How Crossing the U.S.-Mexico Border Became a Crime, or The Largest Deportation Campaign in U.S. History is No Match for Trump's Plan, or Immigration Control, Trump's Mass Deportation System is Rooted in Racism. All of these having appeared in publications and websites far and wide, including The Conversation, Latino USA and NPR, Newsweek, Salon, the Houston Chronicle, and many, many more. Professor Lytle Hernandez is, without doubt, one of those few scholars who walks the walk when it comes to engaging the public in the best and broadest sense of the term. We're extremely fortunate here tonight to have her present on her brand new book, City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, published by University of North Carolina Press just in the last month or two, and copies are for sale just to my right. I've been thinking about the title in a number of different ways, and would say from the refreshing department of calling things what they really are, human caging. Her new work is an unsettling tale that spans 2 centuries to unearth the long rise of incarceration as a social institution bent toward disappearing targeted populations from land, life, and society in the United States. It details when, why, and how the dynamics of conquest made Los Angeles, California, the carceral capital of the world. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kelly Lytle Hernández.
Thank you. Wow, hi everybody. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for that very lovely introduction. Luis and I go way back, actually. We've come up through this profession together. And he said that I was an alumni of UCSD. That's absolutely true. But my father, Cecil Lytle, who's back there, raise your hand, Dad, was a professor here at UC San Diego for many, many years, and a provost at Thurgood Marshall College for about 3 decades, I believe. And so I grew up on this campus, and it's been really lovely to be back here today. So thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to share some of my new work. Okay, so some of you may know this, some of you may not, but Los Angeles, California operates the largest jail system in the United States. And in fact, some people say that Los Angeles operates the largest jail system on earth, that we incarcerate more human beings than any other city in the world. So if that's true, Los Angeles, which is known to be the city of angels, is in fact the city of inmates, the carceral capital of the world. So for this book, for some of my new research, I wanted to dig in deep to understand how Los Angeles built such a large system of human caging, of mass incarceration. And that's what this book does. City of Inmates chronicles the long rise of incarceration in Los Angeles. To find this story, I spent about 7 years tracking down the records that document the history of incarceration in this city. Now, one of the things that's so interesting about this is that the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, and the LASD, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, have destroyed the vast majority of their historical records. Only about 4 boxes of LAPD records remain. So the public documents that will allow us to tell the story about the rise of incarceration in the nation's carceral core no longer exist. But we're very fortunate that the people who fought the rise of incarceration in Los Angeles left reams of records behind. So the people who rebelled against the rise of incarceration in the city left behind what I call a rebel archive that made it possible for me to tell the story of what happened and how we built such a large system of human caging in Los Angeles. Now, this rebel archive stored more than enough evidence for me to tell 6 stories that span 2 centuries of history in California. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to overview those 6 stories for you, talk about how I see them as fitting together, and then dig more deeply into just one of them. So that's the outline of what we're going to do together tonight. So the first story that I found in the Rebel Archive documents the birth of imprisonment in Los Angeles and chronicles the rise of the city's very first carceral trend. And that first carceral trend was the criminalization and the incarceration of indigenous peoples, namely the Tongva, Gabrielino, and Kiz nations that were indigenous to the Los Angeles area. These folks were incarcerated mostly on public order charges, namely public drunkenness and vagrancy and whatnot. And their incarceration dominated the story of human caging in Los Angeles between the Spanish colonial period and the first years of US rule. Now, by 1880, about 3 decades into US rule in Los Angeles, native imprisonment declined and a second carceral trend began. And this one was quite surprising. The second carceral trend in Los Angeles is the mass incarceration of poor white men. Between 1880 and 1910, poor white men, especially itinerants, comprised nearly 100% of the locally incarcerated population in Los Angeles. Put on the chain gang, these white men were forced to build the infrastructure of this growing city. So streets going from Pico Boulevard to Figueroa to Sunset Boulevard were all first pounded into existence by white men on the chain gang. That was a story that surprised me. Now, the third story that I found in the Rebel Archive is about the invention of immigrant detention as a new form of human caging in Los Angeles and across the United States. Created amid the anti-Chinese movement of the 1890s, immigrant detention was then really just an obscure and little used practice of incarceration of indisputably racist origins, of anti-Chinese origins in particular. It is now one of the most dynamic sectors of the US carceral landscape. The fourth story that I found in the Rebel Archive traces how the imprisonment of Mexicans in the United States surged across US-Mexico borderlands during the opening decades of the 20th century. And this is a truly epic tale of rebels and of assassins and of secret codes. But what it's really about is about a binational effort between the United States and Mexico to imprison Mexican dissidents across US-Mexico borderlands, but especially in Los Angeles in the years before the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. Okay, so that's the fourth story. The fifth story is also about the rise of Mexican imprisonment in the borderlands, documenting when, why, and how, and with what consequence, entering the United States without authorization first became a crime. That happened in the year 1929. And this fifth story chronicles in particular how a campaign to stop Mexican immigrants from settling permanently in the United States sparked a project of Mexican incarceration across the borderlands. And this is a history that has never before been told, and it's the one that I'm going to dig into deeper tonight. And now the final chapter in City of Inmates is a chapter that must be told in any history of incarceration in the United States. And that is the chapter about the rise of Black incarceration. So now in Los Angeles, Black incarceration shot from being politically irrelevant and just slightly disproportionate in the year 1900, to being politically dominant, stunningly disproportionate, and chronically lethal by the 1920s, right? So African Americans have not always been targeted for policing and incarceration in Los Angeles, and I would say across the American West. However, since the 1920s, African Americans have been and have remained so ever since. So this final chapter in City of Inmates lifts up the deep and tangled roots of the relationship between incarceration and police brutality in Black LA. And it does so by chronicling the first recorded killing of a young black male by the LAPD, which happened on the evening of April 24th of 1927. This young man's name was Samuel Faulkner. And then it follows the still unfinished protest story that followed the killing of Sam Faulkner right into the present moment. Now, at first glance, this overview of the 6 stories that I found in the Rebel Archive may seem quite scattered. Are some of you wondering how the heck all this fits together? Now, these stories range from the Spanish colonial era to the 1965 Watts Rebellion. They address issues from vagrancy laws to immigration control to police brutality. And they churn through a variety of communities at particular moments in time. But as I argue in this book, these 6 stories, in fact, align on the arc of conquest in the United States, and in particular, on the story of settler colonialism in the American West. Now, settler colonialism is a really popular term that's being used by scholars at this moment. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about how I see settler colonialism and how I'm using it. And while I do that, I want to ask you just to watch this video. What this video does is it shows the dispossession of indigenous populations across the North American continent during the 19th century. Okay. So the United States is a settler state. Now, settler colonialism is a strain of colonization that is not organized around resource extraction or labor exploitation. Resource extraction such as mining and labor exploitation such as chattel slavery absolutely do occur within settler colonial contexts and can be central dynamics of settler colonial life. However, extraction and exploitation are not the principal objectives of a settler colonial drive. Rather, as you see here, settler colonial projects seek land. On that land, colonists envision building a new, permanent, reproductive, and a racially exclusive settler society. Indeed, settlers invade in order to stay and reproduce while working to remove, to dominate, and ultimately replace indigenous communities with a racially homogeneous and a sexually reproductive society. In other words, eliminating indigenous peoples and disappearing racialized outsiders, as well as non-reproductive sexual deviants, is the basic thrust to social relations and institutional practices in settler societies. Or in the words of Audre Lorde, we were never meant to survive. Now, this settler variant of conquest and colonization runs particularly strong in the American West. The racial fantasy of Anglo-American men leading nuclear families in an unending enterprise of settling, procreating, and dominating land, life, and society drove the claiming and the development of the region. Now, to do this, to dominate and control the region, the settlers waged war with indigenous communities, adopted anti-miscegenation laws, attempted to ban African Americans, as well as Chinese and Mexican immigrants from making homes in the American West, and more. And they invested in imprisonment, spurring a phenomenal carceral boom by broadly caging a diverse cast of native landholders and racialized outsiders, variously criminalized, policed, and caged, as vagrants, as drunks, as hobos, as rebels, as illegal immigrants, and as illegitimate residents of a white settler society. In Los Angeles, where local elites imagined building what historian Kevin Starr has described as the Aryan city of the sun, settlers slowly built one of the largest systems of human caging that the world has ever known. Are you all familiar with this painting before I go on? Right, so this is the famous 1872 American Progress painting by Thomas Gast. It really exemplifies the imagination, the racial fantasy of Manifest Destiny, which is the storyline, really, of the American West. Now, how did Los Angeles build this extraordinary system of human caging? Well, it began by criminalizing and caging up the indigenous peoples of the region, namely the Tongva, Gabrielino, and Kiz peoples. In particular, US settlers criminalized native landlessness and native leisure, locking up anyone found with liquor and without work. It really was an extraordinary project that not only removed native men from the streets, but locked them up in a jail that was infested and branded native peoples as drunks and as vagrants in a region that their families had occupied and cared for thousands of years. Imagine that. Within just a few decades, you go from dominating land life and society within a region to being criminalized and transformed to vagrants in your homeland. That's what was happening in the 1850s in Los Angeles and across California, and I would say across the American West. Now, when settler sovereignty seemed secure, local jailing practices changed. Beginning in the 1880s, the settlers criminalized and caged thousands upon thousands of poor white men, but especially the white men dislocated from land and work after the US Civil War and widely disparaged as, quote, tramps and hobos for migrating constantly, living in homosocial communities, all male communities, and loving in homosexual ways. So these white men either could not or would not abide by Anglo-American settler norms, such as heading nuclear families, acquiring native land, and permanently settling down. So even white men can constitute a threat to the settler state. So in Los Angeles and across the American West, authorities caged up these white men, making the American West, not the American South, home to the highest incarceration rate in the country. Now, if any of you have been reading about the history of mass incarceration, in that storyline, what you have learned is that the American South is the epicenter of incarceration. And there's much truth to that. I don't want to throw out that narrative. What I want to say is we haven't talked about the American West, and we haven't talked about other dynamics such as conquest. By the turn of the 20th century, the American West was in fact the epicenter of incarceration in the United States. So after this, with the passage of a series of carceally inflected immigration laws, settlers in Los Angeles, across the American West, and in the United States Congress attempted to deny Chinese immigrants the right to enter the settler-claimed territory, while later allowing Mexican migrants to work in seasonal industries, but to not permanently settle north of the border. Both the invention of immigrant detention and the criminalization of unlawful entry developed amid these unambiguous attempts to stop humans defined as non-white from making their homes in the United States in general, but in the US West in particular. And both immigrant detention and the criminalization of lawful entry pumped up the size of the caged populations in this region. Now, at the opening of the 20th century, when large numbers of African American citizens defied the vision of manifest destiny by migrating west on our own terms, a mass movement of peoples of African descent who moved west with their own feet, with their own dreams, and on their own terms. This constituted a profound challenge to this vision of manifest destiny. When that happened, the response was swift and it was brutal. City authorities in Los Angeles created the conditions for criminalizing, for caging, for expelling, for mauling, and for outright murdering African American citizens. And amid all of this, the Magonistas, a band of political dissidents from Mexico, crossed the US-Mexico border, threatening to oust Mexico's president, Porfirio Diaz, and restore both native and communal land holdings. If the rebels were to succeed, their uprising would not only upend US capital investments in Mexico, but quite possibly ripple north of the border, wreaking havoc for the enduring but always precarious colonial occupation of indigenous lands in the United States. So US and Mexican authorities worked together to hunt the rebels down, arresting thousands of so-called malos mexicanos, bad Mexicans, across the US-Mexico borderlands. I should say that in this hunt, the person that they looked for most of all was Ricardo Flores Magón, the leader of this Magonistas uprising. And they found him in Los Angeles, where they caged him for about 18 months. But from the Los Angeles County Jail, he helped to lead the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. We can get into that story later if you want to hear more. Now, when we string all of these stories together like this on the arc of the settler colonialism in the U.S. West, the stories so tenaciously held by LA's Rebel Archive document that incarceration is a pillar in the structure of conquest in the Tongva Basin. Indeed, as the 2 centuries of history documented in City of Inmates tell, since the very first days of U.S. rule in the Tongva Basin, incarceration has persistently operated as a means of purging, of removing, of caging, containing, erasing, disappearing, and otherwise eliminating indigenous communities and racially targeted populations. However, the Rebel Archive also documents that those targeted for removal have never disappeared. The criminalized, the policed, the caged, and the kin of the killed have always fought back. With acts of survivance more diverse, more resourceful, and more elusive than the settlers' variegated projects of elimination, indigenous peoples of the LA Basin survived carceral elimination and much more. Race rebels and unlawful border crossers also constantly upend disappearance, as do the many queers and deviants who may live within the formal racial boundaries of the settler community, but refuse to perform its social and its sexual reproduction. And the rebels kept a record of it all. Therefore, as much as City of Inmates is about the thread of elimination that winds through our jails, our prisons, and our detention centers, right through the center, the core of the U.S. carceral landscape, which is Los Angeles. City of Inmates is also a chronicle of resilience, of uprising, and of unbroken rebellion. So it's with this story of elimination and disappearance, countered by resilience and rebellion in mind, that I want to take you more deeply into the book's 5th chapter. It's called Caged Birds. And what it does is it documents how the settler campaign to stop Mexicans from permanently settling in the United States led to the rise of Mexican imprisonment in Los Angeles and across the borderlands during the 1930s. So this is the great irony of life and of politics and of the story, that the effort to keep Mexicans out, in fact, caged Mexicans within the country. Now, in the year 1900, very few Mexicans lived in the United States, only about 100,000 residents. By 1930, about 1.5 Mexican nationals lived within the United States. This constituted about 10% of the population of Mexico. This Mexican immigration boom of the early 20th century set off extraordinarily divisive debate in the United States Congress. I must say that Professor Natalia Molina, in her book, How Race is Made in America, goes through these debates quite closely. The issue is that Congress in the early 20th century was trying to create a whites-only immigration system. And by 1924, they had largely done so with the passage of the National Origins Act of that year. And what that did was cut the number of immigrants allowed to enter the United States from anywhere other than Northern and Western Europe. But whenever nativists in Congress, nativists are the people who are most restrictionist against immigrants, whenever they tried to cap the number of Mexicans allowed to enter the country every year, it was employers in the southwestern United States who said no. So US employers had really actively stoked this rise of Mexican immigration in the early 20th century. They wanted Mexican workers to come to their farms, to their mines, and to their homes to do the labor that was needed in the development of this settler society. By the 1920s, Western farmers in particular said that they were completely dependent upon Mexican workers. However, Western employers also believed that Mexican immigrants would never permanently settle in the United States. As one agribusiness lobbyist put it, quote, "The Mexican is a homer. Like the pigeon, he goes home to roost." So on the promise that Mexicans were, quote, birds of passage and, quote, not immigrants, that Mexicans would always labor, leave, and never live in the United States, this is how Western employers successfully defeated the nativist proposals to put a cap on the number of Mexican immigrants allowed to enter the country every year. So the idea was that Mexicans would never stay, that they would never become Mexican Americans. Yet by the close of the 1920s, Mexicans were settling in large numbers across the Southwest. They bought homes, they started newspapers, they started baseball teams, and most important, they got married and they had babies. So these are just lots of images of Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles during the 1920s. And my absolute favorite one is of the 3 women on the beach hanging out, right? So first of all, women weren't really supposed to be here, right? It's supposed to be men coming and going. But you have women who are coming up, and they're not just working, they're engaging in leisure. They're building full lives for themselves. They're hanging out on the beach. Now, monitoring the rise of Mexican-American communities in the southwestern states, the advocates of a whites-only immigration system, the so-called nativists, charged Western employers with recklessly courting Anglo-America's racial doom at its southern border. Western employers agreed that Mexicans should not be allowed to become US citizens. So that was something everyone agreed upon. But they also wanted unfettered access to an unlimited number of Mexican laborers. We need the labor, is what they would roar back at the nativists in Congress. Now, amid this escalating conflict between employers in the West and nativists in Congress, it was a senator from Dixie who proposed a compromise. Senator Coleman Livingston Blease hailed from the hills of South Carolina. In 1925, he entered the United States Congress, committed above all else to protecting white supremacy. And I must say, he was one of the most rabid white supremacists of the so-called tribal 20s. He strongly advocated and supported the lynching of African Americans, which was something that many people in public wouldn't even do. This was the guy. He picked up Tillman's pitchfork. In 1929, as immigration restrictionists in Congress and employers in the Southwest tussled over the future of Mexican immigration to the United States, it was Blease who proposed a way forward. Now, according to US immigration officials at this time, Mexicans made nearly 1 million official border crossings into the United States during the 1920s. They arrived at a port of entry, they paid an entry fee, and they submitted to any required tests such as a literacy test and a health exam. However, at this time, US immigration authorities also reported that many other Mexican immigrants did not submit for legal entry. The entry fees were prohibitively high for many Mexican workers, and there was a long history of US authorities submitting Mexican immigrants to degrading baths and delousing tactics at the US-Mexico border. So why would you walk all the way across the border to get to a port of entry so you had to pay a bunch of fees and be subjected to humiliation? So people didn't do it. So when the debate stalled over how many Mexicans were to be allowed to enter the country every year, what Blease did was very interesting. And he shifted the conversation to stopping the large number of border crossings that took place outside of the ports of entry. And this was an activity that largely Mexican immigrants participated in. What he did is he suggested criminalizing unmonitored entry into the United States, unauthorized entry. According to Blease's bill, unlawfully entering the country would be a misdemeanor, while unlawfully returning to the United States after deportation would be a felony. The idea here was to force Mexican immigrants into an authorized and monitored stream that could be turned on and turned off at will at US ports of entry. Any immigrant who entered the United States outside the bounds of this stream would be a criminal, subject to fines and imprisonment, and ultimately deportation. But this was a crime that was designed to target Mexican immigrants in particular. Now, neither the agribusinessmen nor the restrictionists registered any objections. So Congress passed Blease's bill, the Immigration Act of March 4th, 1929, and this dramatically altered the story of race and crime and punishment across the United States. With stunning precision, the criminalization of unauthorized entry caged thousands of Mexico's proverbial birds of passage. Within 1 year, US attorneys prosecuted 7,000 cases. By the end of the decade, they had prosecuted more than 44,000 cases. Mexicans never comprised fewer than 85% of all immigration prisoners. In some years, Mexicans comprised more than 99% of all immigration prisoners. So by the end of the 1930s, tens of thousands of Mexicans had been arrested, charged, prosecuted, and imprisoned for unlawfully entering the United States, for breaking Blease's law. With 71% of all Mexican federal prisoners charged with immigration crimes, no other federal crime, not prohibition, not drug laws, not prostitution, not the Mann Act, no other law sent more Mexicans to federal prison during this time. Frankly, no other law sends more Mexicans to prison at this time as well. And throughout the entire federal penal system, only liquor crimes created more prisoners during the 1930s. Do you understand what that means? We're still largely in the middle of a prohibition era. No other crime sent more people to prison than liquor crimes first and Blease's bill second. Now, what this meant was that they were going to have to build out the federal penal system to hold all of these prisoners. Until 1930, the US federal penal system was relatively small. There were no federal prisons in the US-Mexico border region in particular, and these were our three major prisons. So what the US Bureau of Prisons was going to have to do is they were going to have to expand the federal penal system to cage up Mexico's unlawful border crossers. The first facility that the Bureau built was La Tuna, a federal jail located just outside of El Paso, Texas. Opened in April of 1932, La Tuna was a sprawling prison farm with a maximum capacity of 420 inmates. Within just 3 months of opening, it was full beyond capacity. So James Bennett, the assistant director of the US Bureau of Prisons, went on an expedition into southern Arizona. Riding a burro on a 25-mile trek that wound across the desert and up into the Santa Catalina Mountains, Bennett promised to find a, quote, sufficiently isolated place to camp some of your Mexican friends, unquote. At the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains, Bennett found an abandoned camp where prisoners could be housed in tents and put to work building a new road. He named the site after the nearest town, calling the roughshod convict labor facility Tucson Prison Camp number 10. Now, I've been studying incarceration, immigration for a very long time. I had never heard of the history of these prisons before. Opened in the summer of 1933, Tucson Prison Camp number 10 was a minimum security convict labor camp. The first warden assigned to Tucson was a man named James Gaffney, who had worked in a prison in Alabama prior to his appointment in the Arizona borderlands. Now, with the help of 5 to 6 unarmed guards, Warden Gaffney supervised inmates as they built a road up, through, and across the mountains to a little town named Oracle. There in Oracle, the settlers in Arizona hoped to build a health resort that would provide them sanctuary during the region's sweltering months. Now, the road work progressed at Tucson, and here we have some images of the men doing the road work up in the mountains. But Gaffney chafed at his new assignment in the borderlands. Mexico's immigration offenders, he complained, were, quote, a thorn in our side. As he put it, a, quote, considerable number of Mexican immigration offenders were escaping from Tucson prison camp, and in his words, ruining my escape record, of which I was very proud of over in Alabama. How did he keep a perfect no escape record in Alabama? Any ideas? Yes? There's a very large chance that they killed the people who attempted to escape, right? So you had armed guards in Alabama. In Arizona, he didn't have armed guards, so he couldn't shoot the people down. And they were running away from this facility. When he reported this high escape rate to the Bureau of Prisons, Ward Gaffney described the escapees as, quote, young Mexicans with very few brains, if any. But the archival record, I would say, suggests that perhaps it was a very intelligent assessment that prompted mass escapes from Tucson Prison Camp number 10. Here I just want to show you that when you go to the Federal Bureau of Prisons records in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, you'll find stacks and stacks and stacks of these reward cards for the large number of people who are escaping from Tucson Prison Camp number 10. Now, why were they running? Well, building the road to Oracle was dangerous. There were 2 deaths and numerous injuries just within the first year of work. And Warden Gaffney, a man with experience in the Southern penal system, the extraordinarily brutal Southern penal system, handed out harsh punishments. Now, among those punishments, what he did was he took a practice that was regularly used in Southern prisons. It's a practice where you put someone in a box called the hole. Have you seen these things? Maybe pictures of them. It's a box about yay big, and it's too small for you, so you have to get down low in it, right? And you would stay in that for like 2, 3, 4 days, maybe even 2 weeks. And what that effectively does is it breaks your body, because you cannot move your entire body for multiple days at a time. Now, what he did in the Arizona borderlands is that he adjusted it a little bit. He went out into the desert, he dug a hole, and he dropped people in that hole and put a 2x4 steel grate on top of the hole and left them out there. So guess what the people did? They ran away. Anytime they got a chance, they ran away. Now, despite the establishment of La Tuna in 1932 and the Tucson prison camp in 1933, the Federal Bureau of Prisons still faced a carceral capacity crisis in the US-Mexico borderlands. In particular, federal authorities in Southern California had no near facility to hold immigration offenders. Without any federal prison in Southern California, all immigrants charged and or convicted of unlawful entry in the region were held within county jails, namely the Los Angeles County Jail. I'll get back to this in a minute. Or they had to be transferred to La Tuna or Tucson Prison Camp number 10. But both of these jails were becoming very, very full with Mexican immigration offenders. So in 1938, to address this federal penal capacity crisis in California, the U.S. Bureau of Prisons opened Terminal Island, a federal prison located in Los Angeles County. So here you have the first sighting of a federal prison in Los Angeles. And it happens through this large national and borderland story about criminalizing unlawful entry. Therefore, by the end of the 1930s, the criminalization of unlawful entry had bulged the federal penal system and tipped its expansion across the borderlands, from El Paso to Los Angeles. As intended, Mexicans comprised the overwhelming majority of all immigration offenders. Having agreed upon nothing but the need to control Mexican settlement north of the border, the nervous nativists and Western employers of the 1920s had made a carceral compromise to confine Mexican migration to authorized and presumably controlled pathways. In capturing Mexico's birds of passage who dared to violate the negotiated terms of managed entry, Mexican imprisonment boomed across the borderlands, established the first federal penal prison, or the first federal prison in Los Angeles, and filled it with Mexicans who, after their term of imprisonment, would be deported or forcibly removed from the country. But stopping Mexican settlement within the United States was also a project aggressively pursued by city elites. And this project was nowhere more important than in Los Angeles. Now, by 1929, Los Angeles was the capital of what's known as of Mex-America, or of Mexican-American life. Second only to Mexico City, Los Angeles was home to more Mexicans than any other community either north or south of the border. Yet, in the 1920s, many local elites regarded their town as the nation's white spot. Could city leaders in Los Angeles, the so-called Aryan City of the Sun, the Eden of the Saxon home seeker, or the nation's white spot, could they contain the rise of Mexican-American life? Could local employers, as promised, extract sweat from Mexican laborers while denying Mexican people a right to full and permanent lives north of the border? These were some of the most important but unanswered questions of the 1920s, questions of race and labor in particular. And they made Los Angeles ground zero for an unfolding social experiment in the pursuit of Mexican impermanence in the United States. Now, the LAPD in particular did its part to still the rebirth of Mexican Los Angeles by arresting and incarcerating an increasing number of Mexicans in the city. Mexican arrest rates in Los Angeles are fairly low and fairly flat until about the 1920s, when they begin to escalate. And it's by 1936 that the number of Mexicans in prison in Los Angeles overtakes the number of white men, that tramp era in particular. Now, the leading charges that Mexicans were being arrested on really matter. And those charges are vagrancy, public drunkenness, and disorderly conduct, public order charges. This matters because, like U.S. immigration restrictions, which limit a non-citizen's right to enter and remain within the United States, within a territory, within a land base, public order charges restrict the right to be within a given jurisdiction as well. Now, public order charges broadly restrict how any person can inhabit public space, but they systematically target the underemployed and the poorly sheltered, who live much more of their lives in public than homeowners and the regularly employed. Right? So if you have a house and you like to drink, you go to your house generally and you drink, right? Or if you have to go to the bathroom and you have a home, you go to your home and you use the bathroom. If you are houseless or if you are landless and you want to drink alcohol or go to the bathroom, you do those things in public. That's how people who are poorly sheltered and underemployed become the subjects of public order policing in particular. Now, Mexicans in Los Angeles were overwhelmingly poor, inconsistently employed, and poorly sheltered during the 1920s and 1930s. By imprisoning them on public order charges for living, for loving, for sleeping, and lounging in public, the LAPD effectively stripped thousands of Mexicans of the right to be within the city, of the right to live within the city. And here are some images of Mexican housing in Los Angeles during this time period, and another one of Mexican men hanging out in the plaza. But many Mexicans fought back. Among them were a group of Mexican mothers, las madres mexicanas, who joined forces to raise money and to hire lawyers to defend the large number of Mexicans being arrested in the city. One of the men that they helped was Pedro J. Gonzalez. In so doing, these women countered a move made by authorities in Los Angeles to cage the beating heart of Mexican-American life in the United States. Now, Pedro Gonzalez was a typical Mexican immigrant to the 1920s. He was born in northern Mexico in 1895. He fled Mexico soon after the Mexican Revolution, and he headed west to Los Angeles, not alone, but with his family, and he began as a casual laborer at the dock. But by 1929, Pedro had started to write jingles for companies that are hoping to cultivate customers among the growing Spanish language population of Los Angeles. And soon, Pedro had his own band, and he had a radio program. Pedro was the first person to broadcast in Spanish from Los Angeles, transmitting on a strong and clear signal between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. He reached an audience of Mexican laborers waking for work in the borderlands. And I should say here that his signal was not just Los Angeles. It reached into Arizona, into northern Mexico, into New Mexico. For them, for Mexican laborers waking for work across the borderlands, Pedro belted out corridos, or Mexican folk songs, which tell stories of everyday living. But most of all, Pedro sang love songs. Indeed, Pedro's program did not play the beats of labor, of marginality, and migration that the employers imagined or hoped would be the sole rhythms of Mexican life north of the border. He strummed, he hollered about love, about family, about loss, about the full frequency of Mexican life. He also dissented against the mass deportations of the 1930s, and he rallied his listeners to join him. All of this made Pedro one of the most famous, in fact, one of the most infamous Mexicans living in the United States during the 1920s and the 1930s. As Pedro's popularity soared, his band, Los Madrugadores, the Early Risers, became one of the busiest Mexican bands playing north of the border. And to advertise their shows, Pedro had publicity photos like this taken and plastered on street posts and passed from hand to hand across the borderlands. In these publicity materials, Pedro and Los Madrugadores do not strike poses of casual itinerancy and labor. Rather, these flyers disseminated the image of a cohort of Mexican men without a pick and a shovel in the frame. It was with their instruments in their hands that Pedro and Los Madrugadores made their living by serenading a community of Mexicans singing and dancing, living and loving full lives north of the border. It was for this, for serenading the rise of Mexican-American life, that Pedro was caged, incarcerated in Los Angeles. The local district attorney in particular wanted Pedro's radio program canceled, but no law existed to remove him from the US airways. So the DA worked with the LAPD, which I would describe as the hopelessly corrupt vanguard of the white settler city then and now, to remove Pedro from the streets of Los Angeles. For years, LAPD officers arrested Pedro on trumped-up charges that were dismissed in court. But in 1934, the LAPD cultivated testimony from two girls stating that Pedro had taken them to a hotel for sex. One of these girls later recanted her testimony, saying that the LAPD had taken her to a warehouse and threatened to send her to juvenile detention if she did not say this. Pedro denied the charges, and one of these young women later recanted her testimony, but the judge held Pedro for trial. And after a lengthy trial, Pedro was convicted and sentenced to serve 50 years in San Quentin State Prison. The man who broadcasted the full frequencies of Mexican life in the United States was going to prison for a very long time. But while Pedro's trial unfolded in Los Angeles, he was denied bail and booked at the Los Angeles County Jail. In the county jail, Pedro joined the growing number of Mexicans being imprisoned in the United States. Incarcerated, he snapped a photo that captured the new rhythm of life in the capital city of Mexican America. Pedro's photo, which he took here inside the LA County Jail, framed men, Mexican men, standing in the corridors of the jail. Who they were and why they were imprisoned, Pedro did not share. The note on the back of this photo simply reads, Los Angeles County Jail, early 1930s. But most likely they had been arrested by local police on public order charges. Over 86% of all Mexican arrests during this time period by the LAPD were on public order charges. Or they were being held in the county jail on federal immigration charges, right? The number one cause of incarceration for Mexicans by the federal government during this time period. Imprisoned for living in public and entering the United States without authorization, they were caged by a settler campaign to stop Mexicans from living north of the border. And this is a story that is far from over. Just last month, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced his plan to aggressively enforce Blease's law, stepping up prosecutions for unlawful entry into the United States, especially in the U.S.-Mexico border region. Soon, our U.S. federal prison system will need to grow once again to cage all of the Mexican and Central American immigrants being convicted for unlawful entry, being convicted for breaking Blease's law. This is pretty much exactly the law as written by Blease in 1929 that Sessions has set out to enforce. And last week, Sessions announced a plan to double down on the war on drugs, a plan that will almost certainly imprison scores of Black, brown, and indigenous youth. Make no mistake about it, this is a settler project of elimination. Indeed, as 2 centuries of history saved by a rebel archive and the nation's penal core make clear, incarceration is a project, a persistent project of elimination, meaning that mass incarceration is mass elimination. But as the rebel archive also makes clear, the criminalized, the police, the caged, the deported, and the kin of the killed have always fought back. Pedro Gonzalez, Las Madres Mexicanas, and many more. We are here today because they fought back, and we will be here tomorrow because of their resistance. And so City of Inmates does not end with the chilling conclusion that mass incarceration is mass elimination. It ends, in fact, with the living and the thriving Rebel Archive, a collection of documents created by the rebels who are now hard at work dismantling mass incarceration in the nation's penal core in Los Angeles. So I want to end by sharing an image with you by the LA-based Immigrant Youth Coalition. It's an image that they use during their actions when they challenge immigrant detention, deportation, and imprisonment. And as with every other record in the Rebel Archive, what this does so powerfully is that it identifies and it defies the eliminatory thrust of the US carceral landscape. So with or without papers, we will always be illegal. Because we don't obey their laws of misery, exploitation, hate, and separatism, they're laws that make sure we are always poor, they're laws that kill us slowly. We jump their borders and defy death because we didn't make borders in our lives. We fight, we resist, we dare. So thank you very much. That is my talk for tonight, and I'm happy to take questions.
Question? Yeah, I want to know, the woman that claimed that Pedro was racist, was she Caucasian?
You know, I don't know. Natalia, do you know that story at all?
I just know the claims were made. That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know.
Before.
Question?
Could you talk about more of the resistance movements that are going on in Los Angeles?
Right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, okay. No, I mean the current resistance movements you want to know about. So usually when I give these talks, these book talks, one of the organizers comes with me to speak about what's happening in the contemporary moment. We weren't able to work that out for today. But if you look at the back of the book, you'll see about 10 documents from major organizations and players in the movement to end mass incarceration in Los Angeles. One of them is a person named Kim McGill, who was an organizer at the Youth Justice Coalition in Inglewood, California. And they have been doing a lot of the work on exposing the way in which gang databases target youth of color, in particular, impoverished youth of color, and making those more transparent databases so that people can get off of them. One of the things that's very exciting that's happening in Los Angeles right now is that you are seeing a synergy between the immigrant rights movement and the people who are working in the movement to end mass incarceration. I'd say up until about 3 years ago, those remained fairly separate, black, brown issues. But it's work like this, ground level actions that people are taking when, for example, we go to the Immigrant Detention Center, the federal center downtown, and we bring people who are part of a variety of community-based organizations, black and brown community-based organizations, to sing to the detainees on the inside, to witness and to protest the caging of immigrants on the inside, and that's being done by a collective of black and brown folks on the ground. That's one of the most exciting things that's happening in Los Angeles right now. Another thing is the merging of the environmental movement and the anti-incarceration movement, that there's currently a more than $3 billion plan to build a new women's jail in LA County. This women's jail is being called gender responsive because it's some kind of twisted feminism that women will be able to keep their children with them inside. So yes, the children will be imprisoned with their mothers, and that is regarded as being gender responsive, that they're not breaking up families. One of the ways that we're fighting this new jail is highlighting the ways in which the land has been made so toxic out in this area where they want to place that jail, so that we're effectively putting women and children in places that will damage their well-being and health. So these are some of the exciting things that are happening in Los Angeles. Really, I would encourage you to, you don't have to buy the book, but just look at the back of it and see some of the documents that are coming from people who are engaged in the movement right now. Rather than me speaking for them, you can read their voices directly.
I really like what you had to say. I grew up in UCLA, and I went through the school to prison pipeline, and I've been incarcerated since 12 years old. I've barely been out. My longest, it's been 2 years since I've been out of New Folsom State Prison, and I know all that, that whole entire prison industrial complex. It's a capitalistic scheme, and it's very disgusting. My question for you is, what are the 3 greatest lessons you learned writing this book?
The 3 greatest lessons, that's a really good question. When I first began to write this book, I thought that I was writing something that's much more similar to what's out there in the history. I thought that I was going to be talking about the rise of black incarceration almost solely, and it is the most disproportionately incarcerated population in Los Angeles and largely across the country, except for indigenous communities. That's not what I found. That when I looked at the archives and I looked at the historical record, I found that many more communities have been targeted at different moments in time, and that it really is going to take a movement that weaves us all together to find a greater humanity and other ways to grapple with the harms that we do to each other, to be able to break this beast. Second, that the movement to end mass incarceration must start talking about colonialism, and we must start talking about indigeneity. It's not something we've really brought in fairly closely. But until we can reckon with how we came to stand on this land and occupy this land that we all meet on here today, we're not going to be able to reckon with the basic tendencies of our institutions and our relations. And that is framed by the genocidal impulse of settler colonialism. So that's 2. That's a big question, thank you.
So you said there's 6 different ways. My brother's an immigration lawyer
Mhm.
in LA. He works for a nonprofit, and he's been telling us how he's been going to cases for he works at for women who've undergone domestic violence and children. So he talks about how he wins the amnesty case, but then when he takes them to court,
Yeah, well, we were on the path of decarceration. I don't know if we were on the path toward a greater humanity and justice. We were on a path of unraveling the size of our penal institutions. We are no longer there, right? So Jeff Sessions in particular has made it very clear that the federal government is going to lead us to what may be a truly uncharted territory of mass incarceration. We'll have to see. I mean, I'm not a, right? Isn't the historians don't deal in the future, right? I deal in the past. There certainly will be another stage of this. Whether it'll be a carceral stage, I don't know. My fear is that unless we talk about truth, reconciliation, and reparations in the movement to end mass incarceration, we're just going to create a new system. So one of the things that's so helpful about the plantation to prison narrative, that is that we had slavery, we had Jim Crow, and now we have mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow. One of the things that's so helpful about that is that it helps us to see that you can demolish one oppressive system without leading toward liberation, with just creating a new one. We may be at the cusp of that we may end mass incarceration. I'm not sure we're actually on that path anymore, but we were heading there. But we weren't on the path toward creating a more just and humane society. That's sad, huh? Sorry.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Kelly. I'm looking around the room and I see a lot of undergrads, and one of the things I always try to encourage undergrads to do is do study abroad, to at least look into it. There's tons of ways to make that possible. And I know that you also studied in South Africa. It's right now that you're talking about truth and reconciliation. Can you just tell us a little bit about what someone who studied in South Africa, did work in South Africa, when you come to the U.S. and you're looking at these sources, what kind of perspective that gives you?
Wow. Yeah, so after I finished my BA here at UC San Diego in ethnic studies, I did a year program in South Africa in Umtata, which is now the Eastern Cape. It's Mandela's hometown, so you would actually see him walking around and no one would bother him. It was really quite amazing, and just outside of Johannesburg on a farm. The time that I spent in South Africa, for me, I went in terms of being from a family that participated in the anti-apartheid movement and wanted to go and see what had happened after the election of Mandela. When I got there, I learned more about indigeneity and the importance of the relationship between communities and land, and what dispersal across land and removal and banishment can do to a community. So I came back here thinking about the Black experience in new ways. So that's, for me personally, how studying abroad, coming out of a radical Black tradition, helped me to think in a more international context about the Black condition, and that we have histories beyond enslavement, that we actually have indigenous histories as well, that need to be talked about. So I guess you're right. There's something about that in this book.
I control the microphone.
Oh, okay.
Can you tell a little bit about your personal experience at UCSD as an ethnic studies major, and how that influenced you to go into academia and study what you studied?
Yeah, that's a good. So actually, I was a chemistry major. Remember that, Dad? For like 3 years. I really thought I was going to go get a PhD in chemistry and, solve all kinds of problems in health and medicine in particular, right? So how many here are biology majors? Probably a lot of people, or sciences. Yeah, they're like, yeah, that's totally me. That was me too. And then I took a class in ethnic studies. George Lipsitz was lecturing his book, The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, and it rocked my world. And I left chemistry almost immediately, and I said, I need to do this with my life. There was something about the ideas, the quest for justice, that I said I could dedicate the rest of my life to doing what he just did in front of me. So it was one class, and that was it. One great, incredible mind.
It's more inspirational to the faculty.
Yeah, sorry.
They put a lot of pressure.
Uh-huh.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Books are for sale in the